Welcome to DREAMLAB Knowledge, where we venture into the darkest corners of possibility to emerge with understanding, perspective, and perhaps a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance that sustains our modern existence. Tonight, we embark on a sobering journey through one of humanity's most profound nightmares. A world where nuclear war has not only devastated our cities and populations, but has also stripped away the invisible web of electricity and technology that holds our civilization together. We will explore what becomes of us when the lights go out forever, when the hum of machines falls silent, and when humanity must confront its most fundamental question: can we survive without the tools we've spent centuries creating? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world plunged into sudden darkness. Not the temporary blackout you might have experienced during a storm, but a permanent extinguishing of the electric heartbeat that powers every aspect of modern life. Imagine the silence where there was once the constant background noise of civilization. No traffic, no air conditioning, no distant aircraft, no electronic hum. In this stillness, you would hear only the wind, the rustling of leaves, and perhaps the distant sounds of other survivors trying to make sense of what has happened. This is not science fiction or distant speculation. This is a scenario that scientists, military strategists, and survival experts have studied extensively. A convergence of nuclear warfare and electromagnetic pulse technology that could transform our advanced civilization into something resembling the distant past, but without the knowledge, infrastructure, or population distribution that made pre-industrial life sustainable. The world we know today sustains over 8 billion human beings through an intricate dance of technology, energy, and global cooperation. Every morning, billions of people wake in climate-controlled homes, flip switches to illuminate rooms, turn taps to access clean water, and connect instantly to a global network of information and communication. They travel in vehicles powered by internal combustion or electric motors, work in buildings that depend on constant electricity, and purchase food grown on industrial farms hundreds or thousands of miles away. This magnificent complexity, built up over centuries of innovation and discovery, rests on a foundation that is simultaneously robust and fragile. Robust in that it has grown to encompass the entire planet, creating redundancies and backup systems. Fragile in that so many components depend on so many other components, creating a web of interdependence where failure in one area can cascade through the entire system. The moment of catastrophe. Our story begins with the unthinkable, the detonation of nuclear weapons across multiple nations. These explosions, whether from a full-scale exchange between superpowers or a more limited regional conflict, release more than just the immediate devastation of blast, heat, and radiation. When nuclear warheads detonate at high altitudes, approximately 30 to 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface, they create what scientists call a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, or HEMP. This phenomenon occurs because gamma rays from the nuclear explosion interact with molecules in the upper atmosphere, creating a cascade of electrons that race downward faster than the heavier positive ions they leave behind. This charge displacement generates an intense electromagnetic field that spreads across vast areas, potentially affecting electronics over an entire continent. The electromagnetic pulse itself consists of 3 distinct components, each with its own destructive characteristics and timeline. The first component, called E1, arrives in mere billionths of a second after the detonation. This incredibly fast pulse generates voltages up to 50,000 volts per meter, inducing massive currents in any conductor it encounters. The E1 pulse is particularly devastating to modern electronics because contemporary devices operate at low voltages with microscopic components that cannot withstand such massive energy surges. Semiconductors, the building blocks of all modern electronics, have tolerances measured in volts, not kilovolts. When 50,000 volts surge through circuits designed for 5 or 12 volts, the result is catastrophic and instantaneous failure. Transistors blow out, integrated circuits melt, and delicate connections vaporize in microseconds. The second component, E2, resembles the electromagnetic interference caused by lightning and arrives over a slightly longer time frame, spanning from microseconds to tens of microseconds. While E2 is less destructive than E1, it can still damage electronic equipment, particularly devices that are already stressed by the initial pulse. Lightning protection systems, which many facilities have installed, might offer some defense against E2, but these protections were typically designed assuming the facility's electronics had not just been ravaged by E1. Moreover, lightning strikes are localized events. An electromagnetic pulse affects entire regions simultaneously, overwhelming any protection systems and making recovery far more difficult than after a normal lightning strike. The third component, E3, unfolds over tens to hundreds of seconds and results from the interaction between the nuclear explosion and Earth's magnetic field. E3 generates powerful currents in long conductors like power transmission lines, potentially destroying transformers and other critical infrastructure components over areas spanning thousands of kilometers. These aren't the small transformers you might see on utility poles in residential neighborhoods. E3 threatens the massive high-voltage transformers that form the backbone of the electrical grid, the kind that weigh hundreds of tons, cost millions of dollars each, take months or years to manufacture, and require specialized transportation and installation. When these transformers fail, the electrical grid doesn't just go dark, it becomes unfixable without the industrial capacity to produce replacements, capacity that itself depends on having a functioning electrical grid. The 1962 Starfish Prime nuclear test, conducted by the United States at an altitude of 400 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean, provided dramatic evidence of electromagnetic pulse effects. Despite occurring nearly 900 miles from Hawaii, the test knocked out streetlights, damaged telecommunications equipment, and disrupted electrical systems across the islands. This occurred in an era when electronics were far more robust than today's delicate semiconductor-based systems. The vacuum tubes and mechanical relays that dominated 1960s electronics could withstand electrical stresses that would instantly destroy modern microprocessors. Modern studies suggest that a similar detonation over the continental United States could affect electronic systems across the entire country, with potentially catastrophic consequences for our technology-dependent civilization. But the electromagnetic pulse is only the beginning of our catastrophe. The nuclear explosions themselves ignite massive firestorms in urban areas, injecting enormous quantities of smoke and soot into the atmosphere. When nuclear weapons detonate over cities, they release tremendous heat. Temperatures at the fireball's center reach millions of degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun. This heat ignites everything flammable within the weapon's effective radius. Buildings catch fire, vehicles explode, vegetation combusts. Humans and animals are instantly incinerated if they're close enough, or suffer horrific burns if they're farther away. But beyond these immediate effects, the fires continue to spread, merging into firestorms that generate their own weather systems, with winds rushing inward to feed the flames and superheated air rising rapidly into the upper atmosphere. Scientific models indicate that even a relatively limited nuclear exchange involving 100 weapons of 15 kiloton yield, approximately the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, could loft 5 million tons of smoke into the stratosphere. These aren't ordinary smoke particles that rain out in days or weeks. These are soot particles heated to high temperatures by nuclear fireballs, carried by rising thermals into the stratosphere, where they spread horizontally and remain aloft for years. A full-scale nuclear war between major powers, involving thousands of warheads, with yields ranging from tens of kilotons to megatons, could inject 150 million tons or more of soot into the upper atmosphere, where it would remain for years, blocking sunlight and triggering what scientists call nuclear winter. The first hours, immediate consequences. In the first moments after the electromagnetic pulse sweeps across the landscape, the effects would be immediate and overwhelming. Electronic devices would fail across vast areas, their delicate circuits fried by the massive voltage surge. Computers, smartphones, modern vehicles with electronic ignition and control systems, and virtually all contemporary electronics would become instant artifacts of a vanished age. The computers that control traffic lights, hospital equipment, water treatment plants, power plants, banking systems, and telecommunications networks would fail simultaneously. The smartphones that billions of people depend on for communication, navigation, information, and even emergency calls would become inert rectangles of glass and dead silicon. The electrical grid itself would suffer catastrophic damage. The E3 component of the pulse would generate massive currents in transmission lines, overwhelming transformers, and other critical infrastructure. The cascade would begin with high voltage transformers failing across the affected region. These aren't simple devices that can be quickly replaced. Large power transformers weigh between 100 and 400 tons, stand as tall as a two-story building, and take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years to manufacture. Each one is essentially custom-made for its specific location in the grid. They're transported on specialized heavy-haul trucks or railroad cars, requiring permits, route planning, and sometimes even road modifications to accommodate their size and weight. Installation requires cranes, skilled technicians, and extensive testing. Without electricity to power the factories and transportation networks needed to produce and deliver replacements, the damaged grid infrastructure would likely remain non-functional indefinitely. For those who survived the initial nuclear detonations, the first hours would be marked by profound confusion and fear. Urban residents would find themselves trapped in suddenly silent cities. Elevators would stop between floors, trapping occupants in dark metal boxes. Those buildings that had emergency lighting might have a few hours of illumination from battery backup systems, but these would quickly exhaust themselves. Traffic signals would go dark, creating gridlock as disabled vehicles block major thoroughfares. Cars manufactured before the widespread adoption of electronic engine management and ignition systems might still function, but these older vehicles are increasingly rare. The vast majority of modern vehicles, with their computer-controlled fuel injection, electronic ignitions, and drive-by-wire throttle systems, would simply refuse to start. Those that were running at the moment of the pulse might stall and never restart, Hospitals would initially switch to backup generators, but most facilities maintain only enough fuel to run for a few hours to a few days at most. Hospital generators are designed to bridge short power outages, not to serve as permanent power sources. Once those generators fall silent, modern medical equipment would become useless. Ventilators would stop, threatening the lives of patients who depend on them for breathing. Dialysis machines would cease functioning, putting kidney patients at immediate risk. Computerized medication dispensing systems would be inaccessible. Electronic health records would be locked away in dead servers. Diagnostic equipment, CT scanners, MRI machines, X-ray systems would all be inoperable. Hospitals would revert to something resembling Civil War-era medical facilities, capable only of basic care, using manual techniques and whatever supplies remained on hand. Water pumps would cease operation, cutting off the supply of clean water to homes and businesses. Modern water systems depend entirely on electric pumps to move water from reservoirs and treatment plants through the distribution network. Even cities located near rivers or lakes require pumping to lift water to elevated storage tanks that provide pressure for distribution. Without power, these pumps would fall silent. Within hours, the water pressure in distribution pipes would drop to zero. As elevated tanks emptied and no new water was pumped to replace what was used, within 24 to 48 hours, most urban water systems would be completely dry. Residents would turn to whatever water sources they could find: swimming pools, hot water heaters, toilet tanks, or any other reservoir of stored water. But without treatment, these supplies would quickly become contaminated. People would face a terrible choice between dangerous dehydration and the risks of drinking unpurified water. Communication would collapse almost instantly. Cell phone towers require electricity to function, and even those with battery backup would quickly exhaust their reserves. The towers themselves are just the visible part of the cellular network. Behind them lies a vast infrastructure of routing equipment, data centers, and connection points to the broader telecommunications system, all of which require power. The internet, that invisible network connecting billions of devices, would vanish. Undersea cables might still physically connect continents, but without powered equipment at each end to send and receive signals, those connections would be meaningless. Traditional landline phones might work briefly in some areas, as telephone systems were historically designed with some inherent resilience, but without power to maintain the switching stations and signal repeaters, even these would soon fail. Radio and television broadcasts would cease, leaving survivors with no reliable way to receive information about what has happened or what they should do. In this sudden isolation, fear and rumors would spread more rapidly than facts. The modern world is accustomed to instant information. When something significant happens anywhere on Earth, within minutes people around the globe know about it through news services, social media, and instant communication. The sudden loss of this information flow would be profoundly disorienting. In its absence, people would rely on word of mouth, but word of mouth without any way to verify information leads to distortion and panic. Rumors of what happened, who is responsible, whether help is coming, what people should do, these would circulate and multiply, often becoming more extreme and less accurate with each retelling. For those outside major cities at the moment of catastrophe, the initial impact might seem less severe. Rural residents might not immediately realize the scope of the disaster. They might simply think their power is out, perhaps from a storm. But as they attempt to drive to town, or call family members, or check the news, they would gradually discover that their vehicles won't start, their phones don't work, and the familiar background noise of distant traffic and aircraft has disappeared. Even areas physically untouched by nuclear detonations would find themselves plunged into a pre-electronic age, but without the knowledge, tools, or social structures that allowed previous generations to thrive without modern technology. The psychological impact during these first hours would be immense. Modern people, especially in developed nations, have spent their entire lives in a world where electricity is always available, where help is just a phone call away, where problems can be solved with technology. The sudden realization that all of this is gone, that there's no power and no prospect of power returning, that the comfortable cocoon of modern civilization has been stripped away. This would be deeply traumatic for many people. Some would experience paralysis, unable to process what has happened. Others would panic, making poor decisions driven by fear. Some would deny the reality of the situation, insisting that help is surely coming, that the power will be back on soon, that this is just a temporary problem. Those who could quickly accept the new reality and begin making rational decisions about survival would have the best chances. But even they would be working with limited information and no clear understanding of how permanent or widespread the catastrophe truly was. The first days. Cascade of systems. Failure. As hours turn into days, the cascade of systems failure would accelerate. Modern society functions as an interconnected web of interdependent systems, each relying on electricity and many requiring electronic controls. As the power grid remains dark and electronic systems stay silent, this web would rapidly unravel in ways that might not be immediately obvious but would become increasingly catastrophic. Water supplies would be among the first critical systems to fail completely. Modern water treatment and distribution depends entirely on electric pumps to move water from reservoirs through purification facilities and into distribution networks. The treatment process itself requires electricity for pumps, filters, chemical injection systems, and monitoring equipment. Even the chemicals used in water treatment often require electricity for their production and transport. Within 24 to 48 hours after power failure, most urban water systems would be completely dry. The elevated water towers that many cities use to provide distribution pressure would empty, and with no pumps operating to refill them, they would remain empty. Underground water mains would still contain some water, but without pressure, this water would become stagnant and increasingly contaminated. Residents would turn to whatever water sources they could find. Swimming pools would be drained by desperate people, often without proper containers to safely store the water. Hot water heaters, which can hold 40 to 80 gallons, would be emptied. Toilet tanks, which hold a few gallons of relatively clean water, would be used up. Bottled water in stores and homes would disappear almost immediately, either consumed, hoarded, or seized by those desperate for any reliable water source. But these sources would last only days at most. After that, people would be forced to seek water from rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, or even puddles and irrigation ditches. Without treatment, these sources pose significant health risks from bacteria, parasites, and chemical contaminants. Boiling water would require fire, which means fuel. In urban areas, people would burn whatever they could find: furniture, wooden structures, paper, cardboard. Trees in parks and along streets would be cut down, often inefficiently, by people with no experience in felling trees or processing firewood. The smoke from thousands of individual cooking fires would hang over cities, adding to the atmosphere of desperation and chaos. Rural residents would have better access to wood fuel, but even they would need tools to harvest and process it. Chainsaws require gasoline, which would quickly become unavailable. Handsaws and axes would become precious items, and most modern people lack the skill and conditioning to efficiently cut and split wood with hand tools. What might take an experienced woodsman an hour could take an unpracticed city dweller all day, assuming they don't injure themselves in the process. The food supply chain would collapse with similar speed. Modern supermarkets operate on a just-in-time delivery system, maintaining minimal on-site inventory and relying on constant truck deliveries to restock shelves. A typical grocery store might have only 3 days worth of food for its regular customer base, and that's under normal shopping patterns. In a crisis, as people realize the severity of the situation, stores would be quickly stripped bare. Without functioning vehicles to transport food from warehouses and distribution centers, without electricity to refrigerate perishables, and without electronic systems to coordinate supply chains or process payments, the entire food distribution system would fail within days. Grocery stores would likely experience desperate looting as people realize the gravity of the situation. This wouldn't necessarily be criminal behavior in the traditional sense. It would be terrified people trying to secure food for themselves and their families when they realized that no resupply was coming. Store security systems wouldn't function without power. Locked doors could be broken. In areas where social order was breaking down, people might simply take what they needed and wanted. Stores that remained locked would eventually be broken into anyway, as hungry people grew more desperate. Refrigerated and frozen foods would spoil within hours once the power went out and stores' backup generators exhausted their fuel. The smell of rotting meat and spoiled dairy would become one of the signatures of the catastrophe. Whatever canned and dried goods remained would become precious commodities in a suddenly resource-scarce world. But even these would run out surprisingly quickly. A family of 4 might consume a can or 2 of food per meal. The average grocery store, depending on its size, might have a few thousand to tens of thousands of canned goods. Split among even a small community's population, this wouldn't last long. The financial system would cease to function entirely. Modern banking depends on electronic records stored in computer databases. Your bank account balance, your investment portfolio, your credit history, all of this exists as electronic data. Without electricity and functional computers, there would be no way to access accounts, no way to verify ownership of assets, no way to conduct electronic transactions. Credit and debit cards would be worthless pieces of plastic. ATMs wouldn't function. Even if you had cash money, its value would be questionable. The faith that gives currency its worth depends on the belief that it can be exchanged for goods and services, that it's backed by a functioning government and economy. When the entire economy has collapsed, when there's no prospect of returning to normal commerce, paper money loses much of its value. It can't be eaten, can't provide shelter, can't purify water. In a world where survival depends on tangible resources, cash would rapidly lose relevance, replaced by barter or by the direct value of useful goods. Healthcare systems would face an immediate crisis of staggering proportions. Modern medicine depends on electricity for everything from diagnostic equipment to life support machines, from refrigeration of medicines and blood supplies to sterilization of surgical instruments. People dependent on electrically powered medical devices would face death within hours or days. Those on ventilators would asphyxiate when the machine stopped. Dialysis patients would face kidney failure without their regular treatments. People with insulin pumps would need to manage their diabetes manually, assuming they had access to insulin, which requires refrigeration. Insulin in pharmacies and hospitals would spoil within days once refrigeration failed. Hospitals would be overwhelmed with injuries from the nuclear attacks and the chaos that follows. But without power, they would be nearly helpless. Surgery could be performed only in daylight or by candlelight and flashlight, assuming batteries remained available. Without power, there would be no way to sterilize instruments in autoclaves. Boiling might serve as a crude alternative, but this requires fuel and time. There would be no blood banks. Blood requires refrigeration and has a limited shelf life, even under the best conditions. The ability to conduct blood tests, X-rays, or any electronic diagnostics would disappear. Medical care would regress by more than a century to an era when doctors had only their senses and basic instruments, when infection commonly followed even minor injuries, and when countless conditions that modern medicine treats routinely would become death sentences. Medicines requiring refrigeration would spoil. Many vaccines need to be kept cold. Insulin, as mentioned, requires refrigeration. Many antibiotics have limited shelf life and some require refrigeration. Even medicines that don't require refrigeration have expiration dates, and without the pharmaceutical industry to produce new supplies, communities would face the slow exhaustion of remaining medicines. When the last doses of antibiotics are used, when there's no more insulin, when vaccines are exhausted, the diseases and conditions these medicines treat would rage unchecked through populations that have lost their immunity or never had it. The psychological impact would be severe as well. The sudden loss of civilization, the death of loved ones, the constant struggle for survival, and the absence of hope for improvement would create widespread depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Without professional mental health care, without psychiatric medications, without even the social support systems that helped people cope with trauma in the past, many survivors would struggle with psychological disorders that further impaired their ability to function. Some would become unable to care for themselves. Some might become suicidal. Others might lash out violently, unable to process their trauma in healthy ways. The mental health crisis would be as real and dangerous as the physical crises, but far less visible and even harder to address. The first weeks, breakdown of social order, as days stretch into weeks with no power restoration, no functioning communications, and dwindling supplies, the social fabric that holds communities together would face severe strain. Human behavior in crisis is complex and varied. History shows us that humans are often remarkably resilient and capable of cooperation in crisis situations. During the London Blitz in World War II, for example, communities pulled together, helped each other survive, and maintained social order despite tremendous stress. After Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, while there were certainly instances of violence and chaos, there were also countless examples of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers risking themselves to rescue those in need. But the scale and permanence of this catastrophe would test human cooperation to its limits. This wouldn't be a temporary disaster with the promise of outside help arriving soon. This would be the realization that modern civilization has ended, that no help is coming because there's nowhere for help to come from. In a world where obtaining food and clean water becomes a daily struggle, where protecting one's family might require force, where the usual consequences of violence have disappeared along with the police and judicial systems, civilization's veneer would crack in many places. Those with weapons and the willingness to use them would have significant advantages in a suddenly lawless world. The Second Amendment has ensured that America, in particular, has more civilian-owned firearms than people. In many other countries, firearms are more restricted, but other weapons, knives, clubs, improvised weapons, would still be available. The question wouldn't be whether weapons exist, but whether people would be willing to use them to take from others or to defend what they have. Some people, shaped by a lifetime of civilization and morality, would find it difficult or impossible to use violence, even in desperate circumstances. Others would adapt quickly to a more brutal existence. Still others would rationalize violence as necessary for the survival of themselves and their loved ones. Rural areas might fare somewhat better initially, with greater access to water sources, more experience with self-sufficiency among at least some residents, and lower population density reducing competition for resources. But even rural communities would struggle without the supplies, tools, and medicines they had previously obtained from the now collapsed distribution networks. Rural residents might know how to garden, how to hunt, how to work with their hands, but they still depended on stores for many essentials. When chainsaws need new chains, when hand tools break and can't be replaced, when seeds for next year's garden aren't available, when the medicine cabinet is empty and there's no way to refill it, rural self-sufficiency would prove more limited than it might initially appear. Cities would become particularly dangerous. High population density means fierce competition for scarce resources. Without running water or functioning sewage systems, urban areas would rapidly become unsanitary. Human waste would accumulate in buildings and streets. Traditional toilets wouldn't flush without water pressure. People would be forced to use buckets or simply deposit waste in areas away from where they lived. But in dense urban environments, there's only so much area available, and waste would accumulate faster than nature could process it. The smell would be overwhelming. Flies and other insects would multiply. Rats, already common in many cities, would thrive. Dead bodies, from the initial nuclear attacks, from violence, from disease, from simple lack of medicine and clean water, would rot where they fell. In normal circumstances, when someone dies, there's a system for handling the body: coroners, funeral homes, crematoriums, or cemeteries. All the apparatus of death management that civilization has developed. Without this system, without the ability to transport bodies to cemeteries, without the tools and fuel for cremation, dead bodies would become a major problem. They would need to be buried, but digging graves by hand is hard labor. And in cities, where would you dig? Through concrete and pavement? In parks where the soil is accessible, but where others are also trying to bury their dead? The contamination of soil and groundwater by mass burials would create long-term health hazards. The residents who could would flee cities, hoping to find resources and safety in less populated areas. This migration would create its own problems. Millions of people, unprepared for rural living, without survival skills, desperate and scared, moving out into the countryside. Rural communities would quickly be overwhelmed. Most modern urban dwellers lack the skills to survive without modern conveniences. They wouldn't know how to find water, how to purify it, how to identify edible plants, how to hunt or trap animals, how to make fire without matches, how to build adequate shelter from natural materials, how to navigate without GPS, how to stay warm without central heating. They would face a steep and often fatal learning curve. Water would dominate human activity during these early weeks. Every day would require finding and securing enough water to stay alive. An adult human needs roughly 2 liters of water per day for drinking, more in hot weather or during physical labor. Add water for basic hygiene, for cooking, For washing wounds, the requirements quickly add up. Natural water sources, rivers, streams, lakes, springs, would become contested resources, with different groups claiming access and potentially fighting to exclude others. People would need to boil water to make it safe to drink, requiring both a container that can withstand fire and fuel for that fire. Metal pots and containers would become valuable. Glass containers would shatter from heating. Plastic would melt. Clay pots, if available, would work but are fragile and not widely available in modern homes. Wood would become a precious commodity, leading to the rapid stripping of trees from accessible areas. Modern cities have parks and street trees, but these are limited resources. Once they're gone, people would need to venture farther to find fuel, possibly into areas claimed by other groups, creating potential for conflict. The labor of cutting, splitting, and hauling wood would occupy a significant portion of each day. Those with the strength and skills to efficiently process wood would have an advantage, but it's exhausting work even for the experienced. For the unpracticed, especially those weakened by inadequate nutrition, it would be brutally difficult. Food acquisition would require even more time and effort than water. Those with knowledge of wild edible plants would have an advantage, but most modern people lack this knowledge. The wild edibles that do exist would be quickly over-harvested by desperate humans. Hunting and fishing would provide food for some, but animal populations would be quickly depleted. In normal circumstances, wildlife populations are managed through hunting seasons, bag limits, and other regulations designed to prevent overharvesting. Remove these restrictions and add millions of hungry humans, and wildlife populations would crash within weeks or months. Fish populations in accessible waters would be depleted even faster. Gardens could be planted, but producing significant food from gardens requires months. Seeds planted in spring wouldn't provide harvest until summer or fall. Many people would starve before their first harvest. Moreover, modern seeds are often hybrid varieties selected for characteristics that make sense in industrial agriculture. High yield, under optimal conditions, uniform ripening for mechanical harvest, disease resistance that assumes chemical pesticides will control pests, but that may be poorly suited to manual cultivation without fertilizers and pesticides. Heirloom seed varieties, better adapted to low-input agriculture, would be scarce. Saving seeds from hybrid plants often produces inferior plants in the next generation, as the hybrid traits don't breed true. Even those who successfully planted gardens would face challenges. Without chemical fertilizers, soil fertility would need to come from compost and manure, requiring labor to create and apply. Without herbicides, weeds would need to be pulled by hand, exhausting, time-consuming work. Without pesticides, insect pests would take a larger share of crops. Animals, from deer to rabbits to birds, would readily eat cultivated plants unless gardens were fenced, and fencing materials would be in short supply. Successful gardening requires knowledge, labor, and time, resources that desperate, starving people would find in short supply. The first months: mass starvation and disease. As weeks turn into months, the true horror of this scenario would become undeniably apparent. Studies by the United States EMP Commission estimated that without a functioning electrical grid and with disrupted supply chains, 66 to 90% of the American population could die within the first year. The primary killer would be starvation, followed closely by disease and violence. These estimates, while debated among experts, illustrate the magnitude of the catastrophe a modern society would face when suddenly deprived of the technological infrastructure supporting its population. Modern agriculture feeds billions of people, but it does so through intensive use of technology, energy, and specialized knowledge. Farmers use tractors and combines powered by diesel fuel. They apply fertilizers manufactured through energy-intensive processes, particularly the Haber-Bosch process that converts atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia for nitrogen fertilizers. Without this industrial nitrogen fixation, crop yields would plummet. They use pesticides to protect crops from insects and diseases. They plant genetically modified or hybrid seeds designed for industrial farming conditions. They rely on extensive irrigation systems powered by electric pumps. They sell their harvest into a global distribution network that transports food thousands of miles from farm to consumer. Every step of this system depends on electricity, fuel, functioning vehicles, and complex supply chains. Without electricity and technology, modern agriculture would cease immediately. The few working farms would revert to manual labor, but most modern farmers lack draft animals to pull plows. Even if they had horses or oxen, most farmers today don't know how to use them. Agricultural education has spent decades teaching students how to operate GPS-guided tractors, how to manage computer-controlled irrigation systems, how to calibrate chemical application equipment, how to maximize yields through precision agriculture. These skills, valuable in industrial agriculture, would be useless in a post-technological world. The knowledge of pre-industrial farming techniques has largely been lost. There are some exceptions. Amish farmers, organic farmers using traditional methods, hobby farmers maintaining old skills, but these are a tiny minority. The global food supply before the catastrophe was already operating near capacity to feed 8 billion humans. Industrial agriculture, with its heavy inputs of energy and technology, has allowed humanity to temporarily exceed the natural carrying capacity of the planet, remove the industrial agricultural system, and that carrying capacity plummets. Without modern agriculture, Earth might sustainably support perhaps 1 to 2 billion people at subsistence level. And that's assuming those people have the knowledge and tools to engage in effective pre-industrial farming, which most modern populations do not. The gap between 8 billion people and what the land can support without technology would be closed through mass starvation, disease, and violence. Winter would be particularly deadly in regions with cold climates. Without electricity for heating, without ability to purchase fuel oil or natural gas, without the infrastructure to distribute these fuels even if they were available, people in cold climates would face brutal choices. Burn furniture and house timbers to stay warm, potentially rendering their homes uninhabitable while exhausting fuel supplies. Attempt to migrate to warmer regions, undertaking dangerous journeys through countryside where others are equally desperate, or simply endure the cold, with many freezing to death or developing pneumonia and other cold-related illnesses that modern medicine could treat, but that would be fatal without hospitals, antibiotics, or even basic medical care. Even in temperate climates, winter would bring challenges. The reduced daylight hours of winter mean less time for outdoor work. Cold, wet weather makes everything harder. Crops don't grow in winter in most climates. Stored food from summer and fall harvests would need to last until the next growing season, a gap of 5 to 6 months in many regions. Historical agricultural societies were well aware of this challenge and developed extensive practices for food preservation and storage. Modern people, accustomed to year-round fresh produce shipped from around the world, would need to quickly relearn these skills or face starvation before spring. Disease would kill almost as many people as starvation. Without modern sanitation, clean water, adequate nutrition, and medical care, infectious diseases would spread rapidly through weakened populations, living in unsanitary conditions. Cholera thrives when human waste contaminates drinking water. The bacterium causes severe diarrhea that leads to dangerous dehydration, which can kill within hours if untreated. With proper medical care, oral rehydration solution, and sometimes intravenous fluids, most cholera patients recover. Without this care, mortality rates can exceed 50%. In a post-catastrophe world with contaminated water supplies and no medical infrastructure, cholera could kill millions. Typhoid fever spreads through contaminated food and water. It causes high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, and sometimes a distinctive rash. Before antibiotics, typhoid killed 10 to 20% of infected people. Those who survived often became chronic carriers, continuing to spread the disease. Typhoid Mary, the famous cook in early 20th century New York, who unknowingly infected dozens of people, illustrates how one asymptomatic carrier can spread disease widely. In a post-catastrophe world, with poor sanitation and no antibiotics, typhoid could ravage communities. Dysentery, whether bacterial or amoebic, causes severe diarrhea with blood and mucus. Like cholera, it leads to dangerous dehydration. Historical armies feared dysentery as much as enemy weapons. Throughout history, more soldiers have died from disease than from combat. Entire military campaigns have been derailed by dysentery, spreading through camps where thousands of men lived in close quarters with inadequate sanitation. Post-catastrophe survivors would face similar conditions: large numbers of people, inadequate sanitation, contaminated water, creating perfect conditions for dysentery to spread. Without antibiotics, even simple bacterial infections could kill. A cut that becomes infected, pneumonia following a respiratory infection, an abscessed tooth, any of these could be fatal. Bacterial infections that we treat routinely with a few days of antibiotics could progress to sepsis, a potentially fatal condition where the body's response to infection damages its own tissues. Before antibiotics, sepsis killed millions. It would do so again in a post-technological world. Parasitic infections would become common. Without proper sanitation, intestinal parasites would spread through human populations. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other helminths can cause malnutrition and other health problems. While not usually immediately fatal, they would weaken people already struggling with inadequate nutrition. Malaria, in regions where mosquitoes carry the disease, would increase as standing water created breeding grounds and people lacked mosquito netting or repellents. Lice and other ectoparasites would plague populations living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Body lice can spread typhus, a disease that has killed millions throughout history and would likely kill millions again. Injuries would be far more dangerous. A broken bone, if it doesn't heal properly, could cripple someone permanently, making them unable to do the physical labor necessary for survival. Without X-rays, setting broken bones would rely entirely on feel and experience. Without antibiotics to prevent infection, even properly set broken bones that pierce the skin could lead to fatal infections. Burns would be common, from cooking fires and heating fires. Serious burns easily become infected, and without the specialized burn care available in modern hospitals, many burn victims would die. Childbirth would become far more dangerous for both mother and infant. Throughout most of human history, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of childbearing age. Even as recently as the early 20th century, before modern obstetric care became widespread, maternal mortality rates were 10 to 20 times higher than they are today in developed nations. Complications like hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor, or eclampsia could easily kill without medical intervention. Infant mortality would also skyrocket. In pre-industrial societies, 25 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood, most in their first few years. This would become the new normal in a post-catastrophe world. The psychological toll would be immense. The sudden loss of civilization, the deaths of loved ones, the constant struggle for survival, and the absence of hope for improvement would create widespread depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Suicide rates would likely be high, as people concluded they couldn't bear the new reality. Without mental health care, without psychiatric medications, without even the social support systems that helped people cope with trauma in pre-modern times, many survivors would struggle with psychological disorders that further impaired their ability to function and survive. The nuclear winter, atmospheric catastrophe. Compounding all these immediate challenges would be the atmospheric effects of nuclear war. The massive firestorms ignited by nuclear explosions would inject enormous quantities of smoke and soot into the stratosphere, where it would spread globally and remain for years. This isn't ordinary smoke that dissipates after a fire is out. These would be soot particles, black carbon from combustion, heated to high temperatures by nuclear fireballs, carried by rising thermals into the stratosphere at altitudes of 10 to 15 kilometers above the Earth's surface. At these altitudes, there's no rain to wash particles out of the air, no weather systems to bring them down. The particles would spread horizontally, forming a global layer that would circle the Earth. This soot would absorb sunlight, preventing it from reaching the Earth's surface. The result would be a dramatic cooling of global temperatures. Climate models suggest drops of 9 to 11 degrees Celsius in average global temperature, with much more severe cooling in continental interiors. These aren't just abstract numbers. Such a temperature drop would plunge the Earth into conditions resembling the Little Ice Age, a period from roughly 1300 to 1850, when global temperatures were significantly cooler than today. During the Little Ice Age, glaciers advanced, growing seasons shortened, harvests failed, and famines killed millions. The nuclear winter would create even colder conditions, and do so suddenly rather than gradually, giving ecosystems and any surviving human populations no time to adapt. Summer temperatures in major agricultural regions could plummet below freezing, creating conditions where crops simply cannot grow. The grain belts of North America, Europe, and Asia would become frozen wastelands during what should be the growing season. This nuclear winter would last for years, not weeks or months. Climate models suggest that temperatures might not return to normal for 5 to 10 years, with some cooling persisting for decades. The combination of cold, darkness, and dry conditions would devastate any remaining agriculture. Growing seasons would be shortened or eliminated entirely. In temperate regions, the frost-free period that allows crops to grow might shrink from 5 or 6 months to 2 or 3 months, or might disappear entirely. Without a frost-free period, traditional agriculture becomes impossible. Plants require sunlight for photosynthesis, and with sunlight blocked by soot in the upper atmosphere, Even plants that survived the cold would struggle to grow. Forests would die, their leaves unable to photosynthesize, their roots unable to access frozen soil. Grasslands would turn brown and dormant. The entire base of the food chain would collapse. Studies suggest that even regions near the equator would experience dramatic cooling. The tropics might seem like they would escape the worst effects, being naturally warmer and closer to year-round growing seasons. But temperature drops of 9 to 11 degrees Celsius would affect even equatorial regions. Areas that never freeze might experience frost. Areas with year-round growing seasons might find their seasons restricted. And these are precisely the regions that would be flooded with desperate refugees from higher latitudes. Regions that would already be dealing with their own collapsed infrastructure and depleted resources. The competition for any arable land capable of producing food would be fierce and likely violent. The nuclear winter would also affect water supplies. Reduced evaporation from cooler temperatures would mean less precipitation. The hydrological cycle that distributes fresh water around the planet would be disrupted, creating shortages even in areas not directly affected by the nuclear attacks or the electromagnetic pulse. Regions dependent on seasonal rainfall for agriculture would face drought. Snow and glaciers that normally melt in summer to feed rivers might remain frozen year-round, reducing river flows downstream. Ocean ecosystems would collapse along with terrestrial ones. Reduced sunlight would kill phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms that form the base of the marine food chain. These tiny organisms produce much of Earth's oxygen and form the foundation of ocean ecosystems. When phytoplankton die, everything that depends on them dies too. Small fish and zooplankton that eat phytoplankton would starve. Larger fish that eat smaller fish would starve. The entire ocean food web would collapse from the bottom up. Fish populations, already depleted by decades of overfishing, would crash. Coastal communities that might have hoped to rely on fishing for sustenance would find the oceans nearly barren. The romantic idea that humans could supplement reduced agricultural output by turning to the sea would prove tragically false. The darkness itself would affect survivors psychologically. Humans evolved under a 24-hour light-dark cycle, with bright sunlight during the day. Our circadian rhythms, our hormone cycles, even our moods are influenced by light. The dim twilight of a nuclear winter, with perhaps 10 to 20% of normal sunlight reaching the ground, would feel wrong at a deep biological level. Seasonal affective disorder, a form of depression linked to reduced light during winter months, would become ubiquitous. The combination of physical hardship, loss, fear, and perpetual gloom would drive many survivors to despair. The long darkness, surviving without knowledge. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this scenario is that most modern humans have lost the knowledge their ancestors once possessed for surviving without technology. A farmer from the year 1800 would be far better equipped to survive this catastrophe than a software engineer or accountant or teacher from 2024. Historical populations lived their entire lives without electricity, without motors, without any of the conveniences we consider essential. They knew how to preserve food without refrigeration through salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation. They knew how to farm with animal power or manual labor, understanding crop rotation, soil management, and seasonal planting without chemical inputs. They knew how to find and prepare wild foods, identifying edible plants and mushrooms while avoiding toxic ones. They knew how to build shelter from natural materials, log cabins, wattle and daub houses, thatched roofs. They knew how to make clothing from plant fibers or animal skins, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing garments. They knew how to navigate without GPS, using the sun, stars, landmarks, and dead reckoning. They knew how to treat common ailments with medicinal plants and traditional remedies. These weren't specialized skills possessed by experts. They were common knowledge passed from generation to generation, taught to children through observation and practice as part of growing up. Modern education has traded that practical knowledge for other skills valuable in an industrial society. We learn to read and write, essential for participating in modern culture and economy. We learn mathematics, science, history, literature, preparing us to be informed citizens and productive workers. We learn to work with computers, to navigate complex social and economic systems, to think critically and solve abstract problems. These are valuable skills for the world as it is, but they become useless in a world without electricity and complex institutions. How many modern people could plow a field by hand, finding the right depth and spacing without any mechanical guides? How many could identify edible plants in the forest, knowing which leaves, roots, and berries are nutritious and which are poisonous? How many could preserve meat through smoking or salting, getting the process right to prevent spoilage rather than creating rotten, inedible food? How many could forge basic metal tools from iron, heating and hammering it into useful shapes? How many could navigate using the stars, finding direction and latitude from celestial observations? How many could survive even a single winter without modern heating, adequate insulation, and stored food? The few people with relevant skills would become invaluable. Experienced farmers who remember older techniques, who learned from grandparents who farmed before industrial agriculture became dominant, would be essential for any community hoping to produce food. Craftspeople who work with traditional materials and methods, blacksmiths, carpenters who know hand tool techniques, weavers, potters, would suddenly find their archaic skills desperately needed. Outdoor enthusiasts with wilderness survival training who have practiced making fire without matches, building shelter from natural materials, finding and purifying water, would have knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Elderly people who grew up in more self-sufficient times, who remember life before ubiquitous electricity, who learned traditional skills from their own parents and grandparents, would be repositories of crucial knowledge. But their knowledge would die with them unless they could find ways to teach others. And teaching requires time, something people focused on immediate survival would have little of. Books could help preserve and transmit knowledge, but which books would be available? The survivors of this catastrophe would not have access to carefully curated libraries of practical information. They would have whatever books happen to survive in their immediate area. A typical public library in a modern city contains thousands of books, but what percentage of them provide useful practical knowledge for pre-industrial survival? Most modern books assume access to stores, electricity, modern materials, professional services, and all the other supports of industrial civilization. A modern gardening book might give excellent advice for suburban gardeners, but assumes they can go to the garden center for seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, tools, and whatever else they need. More helpful would be older books, 19th or early 20th century agricultural texts written for farmers who worked without tractors or chemicals, pioneer journals describing life on the frontier with minimal tools and supplies, historical craft guides explaining traditional techniques. But how many modern libraries maintain substantial collections of such outdated texts? Even with access to useful books, applying written knowledge to practical situations is enormously difficult. Reading about how to raise chickens is vastly different from actually caring for chickens. The book tells you chickens need food, water, and shelter, but doesn't convey the physical reality of hauling water daily, mucking out the coop, dealing with predators, or recognizing signs of disease. Understanding the theory of crop rotation doesn't prepare you for the physical labor of breaking ground with hand tools, the strain on your back and hands from hours of hoeing, or the judgment of knowing when soil is ready for planting, when seedlings need thinning, when crops are ready for harvest. Knowledge must be embodied, practiced, tested through trial and error. And in a post-catastrophe world, errors could be fatal. Plant the wrong crop at the wrong time, and you might have no harvest that year. Fail to properly preserve meat, and you lose precious food to spoilage. Misidentify a wild plant as edible when it's actually toxic, and you might die from poisoning. The transmission of knowledge from those who have it to those who need it would face enormous obstacles. Teaching requires time and patience, resources that would be scarce when everyone is focused on daily survival. Teaching also requires the teacher to demonstrate techniques, but demonstration consumes resources. A blacksmith teaching someone how to forge a tool uses fuel for the forge, iron for the practice pieces, time when the smith could be making tools the community needs. Yet without teaching, knowledge dies with the knowledgeable, leaving future generations to rediscover everything from scratch. Language barriers would complicate knowledge transmission. In cosmopolitan cities before the catastrophe, people speaking dozens or hundreds of languages lived together, relying on technology and professional interpreters to bridge communication gaps. After the catastrophe, when a community includes people from diverse linguistic backgrounds but lacks translators and translation apps, teaching and coordinating becomes far more difficult. Valuable knowledge possessed by someone who speaks only Mandarin or Spanish or Arabic might be inaccessible to community members who speak only English. Literacy itself might decline over generations. In a world where every waking hour must be devoted to obtaining food, water, and shelter, where would people find time to teach children to read? Parents would need to teach their children survival skills as a priority. Reading, while valuable, doesn't fill empty bellies or prevent freezing. Basic survival skills would take priority over education. Children might learn to read if time and energy allowed, but many might not, especially in communities struggling at the edge of survival. Within a few generations, literacy could become rare, possessed only by small groups who manage to maintain educational traditions despite harsh circumstances. The accumulated knowledge of human civilization, even the parts preserved in surviving books, could be lost not through destruction of the records, but through the loss of the ability to read and understand those records. The rebirth of ancient crafts. For communities that managed to stabilize and survive the initial catastrophe, the rebirth of ancient crafts would become essential. Modern industrial society has separated most people from the physical creation of the objects they use. We purchase tools, clothing, containers, and countless other items manufactured in factories far away. Few people know how to make these items themselves. But in a post-catastrophe world without industry, without factories, without the ability to purchase manufactured goods, communities would need to relearn the craft knowledge that sustained human societies for thousands of years. Blacksmithing would be among the most critical skills to re-establish. Iron and steel tools are essential for agriculture, construction, and countless other tasks. Shovels, axes, saws, hammers, nails, hinges, plows, knives, all of these require metalworking to produce. The blacksmith's forge becomes the heart of technological capability for any community. But blacksmithing is not a simple skill. It requires understanding how to build and maintain a forge, how to create the high temperatures needed to work iron, how to recognize when metal is at the right temperature for forging, how to shape metal through hammering and bending, how to temper steel to the right hardness, how to join pieces through forge welding or riveting. A forge requires a heat source capable of reaching temperatures of over 1000 degrees Celsius. This requires good fuel. Charcoal burns hotter and cleaner than wood, and forced air to increase combustion temperature. Forced air means bellows, which must be constructed from leather or other airtight materials. The bellows must be operated continuously during forging, often by an apprentice while the smith works the metal. The forge must be constructed from materials that can withstand the intense heat, typically stone or brick. The anvil, the heavy metal block on which hot iron is hammered into shape, must be solid and stable, providing a solid base for the hundreds or thousands of hammer blows needed to shape a piece of iron. The iron itself must be obtained somehow. In a post-catastrophe world, iron ore mining and smelting would likely be beyond most communities' capabilities initially. Smelting iron from ore requires even higher temperatures than forging, requires understanding the chemistry of reduction, reactions to free metal from oxide ores, and produces iron that is mixed with slag and impurities. Historical iron smelting was a complex process that took generations to perfect. More practical for early survivors would be scavenging iron from the ruins of civilization. Cars, buildings, machinery, all contain substantial amounts of steel and iron that could be cut apart and reworked. This scavenged iron would be the raw material for the first generation of post-catastrophe blacksmiths, but even working with scavenged iron requires knowledge and skill. Different types of steel have different properties. Some steel is too hard and brittle for certain applications. Some is too soft. The blacksmith must be able to recognize different types by their spark patterns when ground, by how they respond to hammering, by how they behave when heated and cooled. The blacksmith must understand heat treatment, heating steel to critical temperature, and then controlling how it cools to achieve desired hardness and toughness. Quenching in water creates very hard but brittle steel, suitable for cutting edges. Air cooling creates softer, tougher steel, better for applications requiring strength without brittleness. Tempering, the process of carefully reheating quenched steel to reduce brittleness while maintaining hardness, requires understanding the color changes that indicate steel temperature in the absence of thermometers. Successful blacksmithing also requires an understanding of what shapes and designs work for different tools. A shovel blade needs to be thin enough to penetrate soil easily but thick enough not to bend. It needs to be shaped to shed soil and oriented at the right angle to the handle. An axe head needs careful shaping to split wood efficiently, with the right profile and weight distribution. A plow needs to be designed to cut through soil at the right depth and turn it over. These aren't intuitive designs that anyone could figure out from first principles. They're the result of generations of trial and error, refinements building on refinements. A blacksmith in a post-catastrophe world would ideally have access to examples of well-designed historical tools to copy, or at minimum, to books with illustrations and descriptions of proper tool designs. Beyond blacksmithing, countless other crafts would need to be re-established. Carpentry would be essential for building structures, creating furniture, and making countless wooden implements, but carpentry without power tools is slow, difficult work requiring sharp hand tools and substantial skill. Woodworking with hand tools means understanding wood grain, knowing how different species of wood behave, selecting appropriate pieces for different applications, using saws, chisels, planes, and other hand tools efficiently. It means understanding joinery, the techniques for joining wood pieces together strongly without screws or nails, which might be scarce. Traditional joinery like mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, and lap joints require precision and practice to execute well. Pottery and ceramics would be essential for creating containers, cookware, and vessels. Clay, when fired at high temperatures, becomes hard, durable, and waterproof. But finding suitable clay, preparing it properly, shaping vessels that won't crack during drying or firing, and building and operating a kiln capable of reaching the necessary temperatures all require substantial knowledge and skill. Historical pottery represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about clay types, preparation techniques, forming methods, glazes, and firing. Textile production would be critical for creating clothing, bedding, bags, rope, and countless other necessities. This would require re-establishing the entire chain from raw material to finished cloth. Wool must be sheared from sheep, cleaned, carded to align fibers, spun into thread, and then woven into fabric. Plant fibers like flax or cotton must be grown, harvested, processed into fibers, spun, and woven. Every step requires specific tools and techniques: spinning wheels or drop spindles for creating thread, looms for weaving thread into cloth. Knowledge of patterns and techniques for creating different types of fabric. The dyeing of fabric requires additional knowledge of which plants produce which colors and how to fix dyes so they don't wash out. Leather working would be essential for shoes, boots, belts, bags, harnesses for draft animals, and numerous other items. This requires not only the skills of cutting and sewing leather, but the earlier step of tanning hides to preserve them and make them supple. Tanning is a complex chemical process, traditionally using tannic acid from tree bark or other chemicals to preserve animal skins. Improperly tanned leather will rot, stiffen, or deteriorate. Traditional tanning takes weeks or months and requires substantial knowledge to do successfully. Rope making would be a crucial craft. Rope is needed for countless purposes, from hauling and lifting to securing loads to creating fishing nets. Traditional rope making involves twisting together fibers, plant fibers, animal hair, or strips of leather in specific patterns that create strength. Different types of rope are needed for different purposes, and creating quality rope requires understanding fiber types, twisting techniques, and appropriate applications. Basket weaving might seem like a simple craft, but baskets were essential containers throughout pre-industrial history for carrying, storing, and processing goods. Different basket designs and weaving techniques created containers suitable for different purposes. Some baskets needed to be watertight for carrying water or liquids. Others needed to allow airflow for storing food. The knowledge of which materials to use, how to prepare them, and which techniques create which properties would be essential. Water management and sanitation. Access to clean water would be perhaps the single most critical factor in survival and the foundation for any stable community. Yet water management without technology poses enormous challenges that modern people often underestimate. our ancestors developed sophisticated techniques for finding, accessing, storing, and purifying water. Techniques that would need to be relearned or reinvented. Finding water sources would be the first challenge. In some regions, water is abundant. Rivers, streams, lakes, springs appear regularly across the landscape. In other regions, surface water is scarce, requiring knowledge of where groundwater might be accessed through wells, or how to recognize the signs that indicate hidden water sources. Animals often know where water is and follow predictable paths to watering holes. Vegetation is lusher near water. Certain plants grow only where groundwater is near the surface. These natural signs could guide water seekers, but understanding them requires observation and experience. Once water is located, accessing it might require infrastructure. Rivers and streams provide relatively easy access, though banks might be steep or muddy. Lakes and ponds are accessible, but their water might be stagnant and contaminated. Springs, where groundwater emerges naturally, provide some of the cleanest water, but may produce only small volumes. Wells access groundwater and were the primary water source for many pre-industrial communities, but digging wells by hand is difficult, dangerous work. Wells must be dug deep enough to reach the water table, which might be anywhere from a few feet to hundreds of feet down. The deeper the water table, the more difficult the digging. Workers must excavate the hole, shore up the walls with stone or brick to prevent collapse, and somehow remove the spoil as the hole gets deeper. Drawing water from deep wells without electric pumps requires either hand-operated pumps or a bucket on a rope or chain. Hand pumps work well, but require iron components, precisely machined, including valves and seals, beyond the capacity of early post-catastrophe communities. Buckets on ropes can access water at any depth, but hauling water from a deep well is hard work. Historical well designs often included counterweights or pulley systems to make hauling easier, but these required engineering knowledge and materials for construction. Storing water for times when access to sources is difficult requires containers. In pre-industrial societies, water was stored in ceramic vessels, wooden barrels, or metal tanks. Ceramic vessels can be made locally if clay and kiln technology are available. Large ceramic vessels can hold substantial water but are fragile and difficult to transport. Wooden barrels require cooperage skills, creating watertight vessels from curved wooden staves bound with metal hoops. Metal tanks require metal working capability beyond simple blacksmithing. Stone cisterns could collect and store rainwater if communities had the skill and resources to excavate and line them. Purifying water would be essential, as untreated water from most sources contains pathogens that cause disease. Boiling is the most reliable method, killing bacteria, viruses, and parasites that cause illness. But boiling requires fuel and a container that can withstand fire, resources that might be scarce. Boiling also doesn't remove chemical contaminants or heavy metals. Filtration through sand and gravel can remove some contaminants and was used historically in early water treatment systems. Cloth filters can remove larger particles and some parasites, but won't stop bacteria or viruses. Storing water in sunlight in clear containers can disinfect through solar UV radiation, but this requires appropriate containers and sunny weather. Certain plants have antimicrobial properties and were traditionally used to help purify water. Moringa seeds, when crushed and added to water, can clarify it and reduce bacterial content. Other plants produce compounds that can help purify water. But this requires knowing which plants to use and how to prepare and use them correctly. Sanitation, the safe disposal of human waste, would be critical for preventing disease. When human waste contaminates water supplies or soil where food is grown, diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly. Pre-industrial societies developed various approaches to sanitation. The simplest is defecating away from living areas and water sources, letting nature decompose the waste. This works for small populations in large areas but becomes problematic with higher population density. Outhouses or latrines provide somewhat more sanitary disposal, concentrating waste in pits dug for purpose. The pits must be located where they won't contaminate groundwater. When pits fill, they're covered and new pits dug elsewhere. More sophisticated sanitation requires human effort to collect and dispose of waste. Before modern sewage systems, some cities had people who collected human waste from households, transporting it outside the city for disposal or use as fertilizer. This is unpleasant, dangerous work, exposing workers to disease, but it prevents waste from accumulating in living areas. Some historical societies developed remarkably sophisticated sanitation systems. Roman cities had sewer systems that carried waste away. Some Asian societies had complex systems for collecting human waste to use as agricultural fertilizer, which when properly managed can recycle nutrients safely. But all these approaches require organization, labor, and often infrastructure that early post-catastrophe communities would struggle to create. Food preservation and storage. Producing food is only half the challenge. Preserving and storing it so that it remains edible until needed is equally important. Pre-industrial societies had limited growing seasons, especially in temperate climates, but needed food year-round. This required sophisticated food preservation techniques that modern people, accustomed to refrigeration and a globalized food system providing fresh food year-round, have largely forgotten. Drying is one of the oldest and simplest preservation methods. Removing water from food prevents bacterial and fungal growth, allowing food to be stored for months or even years. Meat can be cut into thin strips and dried in sun and wind to create jerky. Fish can be dried similarly. Fruits can be dried, though they work better if they're high in sugar, which helps preserve them. Vegetables can be dried but often need blanching first to stop enzyme activity. Grains and legumes are naturally dried in the field before harvest and store well if kept dry. But drying requires appropriate weather, sun and low humidity. In humid climates or during wet seasons, food may mold before it dries completely. Salting preserves food by creating an environment too salty for bacterial growth. Meat and fish can be heavily salted, either by packing them in salt or by soaking them in brine. The salt draws water out of the food and prevents spoilage. Salted meat and fish can last for months or years if stored properly, but this requires salt, which might not be readily available. Coastal communities can produce salt by evaporating seawater, but this requires labor and the right weather conditions. Inland communities would need to find salt deposits or trade for salt, making it a precious commodity. Smoking preserves food through a combination of drying and the antimicrobial compounds in wood smoke. Meat and fish are the foods most commonly smoked. The food is hung in a smokehouse where a slow, smoky fire produces smoke that permeates the food over days or weeks. The smoke flavors the food while the heat dries it, and the smoke compounds help prevent spoilage. But smoking requires substantial fuel and a properly constructed smokehouse that contains smoke while allowing moisture to escape. Fermentation preserves food through the activity of beneficial bacteria or yeasts that create acidic or alcoholic conditions that prevent spoilage. Vegetables like cabbage can be fermented with salt to create sauerkraut, which can store for months. Milk can be fermented to create cheese or yogurt, which lasts longer than fresh milk. Grains can be fermented to create beer, which is both safer to drink than questionable water and provides calories. But fermentation requires knowledge of proper techniques, as incorrect fermentation can result in spoilage or even dangerous toxins, rather than safe preserved food. Pickling preserves food in acidic brine. Vegetables are the most commonly pickled foods. The acid environment prevents bacterial growth. Vinegar, produced by fermenting alcohol, provides the acid for pickling. But vinegar production requires first producing alcohol through fermentation, then allowing acetic acid bacteria to convert the alcohol to acetic acid. This requires knowledge, appropriate containers, and time. Root cellars provide cool, humid storage for certain foods. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets can be stored in root cellars for months. Apples and some other fruits also store well in cool, humid conditions. But root cellars must be properly constructed, usually dug into the ground or built into hillsides, to maintain the right conditions. They must be cool but not freezing, humid but not wet, and protected from rodents and other pests. Canning, the process of sealing food in airtight containers and heating it to kill spoilage organisms, is a relatively modern preservation technique developed in the early 19th century. It's highly effective but requires glass jars with proper sealing lids and a heat source to boil the jars for processing. Whether post-catastrophe communities would have access to canning jars and lids is questionable. Even if they did, the knowledge of proper canning techniques is essential. Improper canning can result in botulism, a potentially fatal form of food poisoning. Storing preserved food requires appropriate conditions and protection from pests. Dried foods must be kept dry or they'll mold. Salted and smoked foods must be kept cool and dry. Fermented foods must be kept in conditions that prevent continued fermentation or spoilage. All stored foods must be protected from insects, rodents, and other animals that would eagerly consume human food stores. Historical societies used various containers for storage: ceramic jars, wooden barrels, woven baskets, cloth bags, and various methods to protect against pests, including storing food in elevated structures, using herbs and other repellents, and sometimes employing cats or other predators to control rodent populations. The structure of post-catastrophe communities. Communities that successfully navigated the initial catastrophe and managed to stabilize would likely develop social structures that differ significantly from modern societies, but show similarities to historical pre-industrial communities. These structures would be shaped by the realities of manual labor, limited resources, and the need for cooperation in the absence of technological supports. Family units would likely become more economically integrated than in modern society. In industrial societies, work typically occurs outside the home, and family members often pursue independent careers. In post-catastrophe communities, the family would likely function as an economic unit, with all members contributing to the family's survival through labor. Children would begin helping with simple tasks as soon as they were capable, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew. Elderly family members who could no longer perform heavy labor would contribute through teaching, childcare, light work, and preserving knowledge. The multi-generational household, common throughout most of human history, but less common in modern developed nations, would likely become the norm again. Gender roles would evolve in response to the demands of survival. Throughout most of history, labor was divided along gender lines, with men typically doing heavy agricultural work, construction, and crafts requiring significant strength, while women focused on food preparation, textile production, childcare, and lighter agricultural tasks. However, these divisions were never absolute and varied considerably across cultures and circumstances. In post-catastrophe communities, the division of labor might follow similar patterns, but communities that could avoid rigid limitations would benefit from accessing the full range of human talent. A woman strong enough and skilled enough to be an excellent blacksmith should be able to pursue that craft. A man with the patience and skill for textile work should be able to develop those abilities. Survival would depend on effectively using the capabilities of all community members, regardless of gender. Leadership structures would likely emerge organically based on competence and trust, rather than on the democratic processes common in modern societies. Elections require infrastructure, voter registration, ballots, polling places, vote counting, that might not be feasible in early post-catastrophe communities. Leadership would more likely emerge based on demonstrated ability. The person who successfully organizes food production might become a leader. The person who mediates disputes fairly might become a leader. The person with knowledge of medicine might become influential. The person who proves brave and capable in defending the community might lead its defense. Multiple people might lead in their areas of expertise rather than having single leaders controlling everything. Communities would need to develop systems for resource allocation and dispute resolution. In the absence of money and formal markets, resources might be distributed based on need, on contribution to community work, or through barter systems. Disputes over resources, personal conflicts, and questions of justice would need resolution mechanisms. Historical societies used elders, councils, community assemblies, or leaders to resolve disputes. Post-catastrophe communities would likely develop similar systems, shaped by the backgrounds and preferences of community members, but ultimately needing to provide fair resolution that community members accepted as legitimate. Trade between communities would likely develop as communities specialized in products they could produce effectively and traded for what they needed from others. A community near iron deposits might smelt and work iron, trading iron tools for food from farming communities. A coastal community might trade fish and salt for inland resources. This trade would require establishing routes and methods of exchange. Initially, trade might be simple barter, but as trade networks developed, some form of currency might emerge to facilitate exchanges. This might be precious metals like gold or silver, might be essential goods like salt or grain that everyone needs, or might be symbolic tokens agreed upon by trading communities. Education would be transformed from modern schooling to apprenticeship and direct teaching of practical skills. Formal schooling requires teachers dedicated to teaching, school buildings, books and materials, and children with time to attend rather than needing to work. Early post-catastrophe communities might lack all these resources. Instead, children would learn through observation and participation, working alongside parents and other adults, gradually mastering skills through practice. A child might learn farming by working in the fields, learn cooking by helping prepare meals, learn carpentry by assisting with construction, learn to read, if literacy is maintained, through informal teaching in whatever time is available. This apprenticeship model was how most people learned throughout history and would likely return in post-catastrophe societies. Religion and spirituality would likely play significant roles in post-catastrophe communities. Throughout history, religion has provided meaning, comfort, social cohesion, and moral frameworks for societies. In the traumatic aftermath of catastrophe, people would likely turn to religious or spiritual beliefs for comfort and explanation. Communities might maintain religious practices from before the catastrophe, might develop new syncretic beliefs combining elements from various traditions, or might create new religious movements interpreting the catastrophe through spiritual lenses. Religious leaders could become community leaders, providing not just spiritual guidance but practical leadership in rebuilding society. Children in the post-catastrophe world, the experience of children born into this new world deserves particular attention, as they would face a dramatically different childhood than modern children, and even than children of most pre-industrial societies. Child mortality would be high, as it was throughout most of human history. Without modern medicine, vaccinations, antibiotics, or even basic prenatal care, many children would die in infancy or early childhood from diseases, injuries, or complications that modern medicine prevents or treats routinely. Those who survived would face different challenges and opportunities than modern children. Children would begin contributing labor to their family's survival at young ages. A 5 or 6-year-old might be expected to fetch water, gather firewood, help with simple cooking tasks, feed animals, or watch younger siblings. These aren't the chores of modern childhood, which are often pedagogical exercises in responsibility. These would be genuine contributions to family survival, necessary work that must be done, and children would be expected to do their part as soon as they were physically capable. By adolescence, children would be expected to work as hard as adults, performing adult-level labor in fields, crafts, or whatever work their family engaged in. The physical demands on children's bodies would be intense. Human bodies aren't fully developed until late adolescence, and heavy labor during childhood can cause developmental problems, injuries, and long-term health issues. Yet survival might require this labor. The ethical dilemma of protecting children's development versus meeting immediate survival needs would face every family and community. Education, as mentioned, would be transformed. Literacy, if communities maintained it, would be taught informally, perhaps in evening hours after work was done, or during winter months when agricultural labor was minimal. Not all children might have the opportunity to become literate. Those who did would likely learn through whatever books remained available, rather than through curricula designed for age-appropriate learning. Mathematics beyond basic arithmetic might be rare. Science, history, literature, these might be preserved only in communities that prioritized education despite the costs. Yet children in post-catastrophe communities would also gain things that modern children often lack. They would have direct experience with the natural world, understanding weather patterns, animal behaviors, plant cycles in ways that modern children typically don't. They would see clearly how their work contributes to family and community survival, giving them a sense of purpose and importance that modern children often lack. They would develop close relationships within their communities, knowing everyone and being known by everyone from birth. They would learn practical skills through hands-on experience, becoming competent in crafts and knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. The emotional and psychological development of post-catastrophe children would be shaped by their circumstances. They would grow up seeing death regularly, losing siblings to disease, seeing adults injured or killed by accidents or violence, never knowing the security and optimism that characterizes childhood in safe, prosperous societies. This might make them more psychologically resilient in some ways, better able to accept hardship and loss, or it might create trauma that affected them throughout their lives. The absence of childhood psychologists and therapists would mean that traumatized children would need to heal through whatever support their families and communities could provide. For children born after the catastrophe, the world before would be like mythology, stories told by parents and grandparents about a magical time when lights turned on with the flip of a switch, when people could speak instantly with others far away, when sickness could be cured with medicines. They might find these stories difficult to believe, might think their elders were exaggerating or fantasizing. Their entire worldview would be shaped by the reality they experienced, a world of manual labor, limited horizons, constant physical demands, and the immediate presence of nature, unmediated by technology. They would develop their own culture, their own stories and songs and celebrations, their own ways of making meaning from their circumstances. The long view, generations in darkness, even under the best circumstances, with organized communities preserving knowledge and developing effective survival strategies. Recovery to anything resembling pre-catastrophe civilization would take generations, possibly centuries. The first generation of survivors would focus entirely on immediate survival, obtaining food, water, and shelter, establishing security, organizing their communities, dealing with trauma and grief. They would be dealing with the constant challenge of staying alive in a suddenly hostile world. The second generation, those born shortly after the catastrophe to parents who remembered the previous world, would grow up in a transitional time. They would hear stories of the world before, but would have no personal memory of it. Their entire childhood would be shaped by the struggle for survival, by manual labor from a young age, by a life that would seem unimaginably hard to their grandparents, who once knew modern conveniences. These children would develop their own identity separate from the previous civilization, shaped by their lived experience rather than by memories of abundance. As the second generation matured and had children of their own, the third generation would be born into a world several decades removed from the catastrophe. To them, the previous civilization would be ancient history, stories passed down but increasingly divorced from their reality. They might view the ruins of cities with the same wonder and incomprehension that medieval Europeans felt viewing Roman ruins, recognizing that these structures represented great accomplishments, but having no clear understanding of how they were created or what they were for. Over generations, if communities maintained stability and preserved knowledge, slow progress might be possible. Population could gradually increase as communities adapted to their new circumstances and developed reliable food production. Simple technologies might be rediscovered or reinvented. Better plows, improved techniques for working metal, more efficient methods of preserving food, water mills and windmills to provide mechanical power. Communities might develop simple machines like pulleys and levers to multiply human strength for construction and industry. The knowledge of leverage, gears, and mechanical advantage doesn't depend on advanced technology. These principles were understood and applied by ancient civilizations, but the path back to advanced technology would be extraordinarily difficult and might prove impossible. Many modern technologies depend on a foundation of earlier technologies, creating a ladder where each rung must be climbed before reaching the next. You cannot build a computer without first developing the ability to refine silicon to extraordinary purity, to manufacture semiconductors with nanometer precision, to generate reliable electricity. You cannot develop these capabilities without the industrial infrastructure that itself requires advanced technology to create. It's possible that recovering civilization would take a different path than our historical development, finding new solutions to old problems. But it's also possible that key technologies might remain beyond reach for centuries, locked away by the requirements of manufacturing processes that themselves require the advanced technology to be recovered. The environmental recovery would follow its own timeline. The soot injected into the stratosphere by nuclear explosions would gradually settle out of the atmosphere over a period of 5 to 10 years. Temperatures would slowly return toward normal, growing seasons would lengthen, and agriculture would become more viable. But the environmental damage would persist for much longer. Ecosystems disrupted by nuclear winter would take decades or centuries to recover. Species driven extinct during the crisis would be lost forever. The careful balance of natural systems would need to re-establish itself, a process that occurs on timescales far longer than human lifetimes. Climate itself might be permanently altered. The massive injection of carbon dioxide from burning cities and forests, combined with the loss of carbon-absorbing forests and the disruption of ocean ecosystems, could affect global climate for centuries or millennia. Whether this would lead to warming or cooling, or some complex pattern of regional changes, would depend on factors too complex to predict with confidence. The survivors would simply need to adapt to whatever climate they found themselves in. Conclusion: the weight of the present. As we emerge from this exploration of a dark possible future, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the scenario we've explored is not impossible. Nuclear weapons exist in the arsenals of 9 nations, with thousands of warheads on operational status ready to launch within minutes. The knowledge of how to create electromagnetic pulses exists and has been demonstrated. The systems that sustain modern civilization, electrical grids, telecommunications networks, transportation systems, supply chains, are fragile and interdependent, vulnerable to cascading failures when stressed beyond their design parameters. The good news, if we can call it that, is that this scenario is not inevitable. Nuclear war is not foreordained. The international community has shown it can work to reduce nuclear arsenals, from peaks of over 60,000 warheads during the Cold War to approximately 12,000 today, and prevent proliferation. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and various strategic arms limitation agreements have helped reduce nuclear risks. Continued efforts in diplomacy, arms control, and building understanding between nations can further reduce these risks. Individual communities can build resilience without waiting for catastrophe. Learning skills that increase self-sufficiency, growing food, preserving food through canning or fermentation, basic carpentry and repair, first aid, wilderness survival techniques, enriches lives while also increasing resilience. These skills have value regardless of whether catastrophe strikes. A person who can grow some of their own food, repair their possessions rather than replacing them, and provide basic first aid for their family gains independence, saves money, and enjoys the satisfaction of mastering practical skills. If catastrophe does strike, they have knowledge that improves their chances of survival. If it doesn't, they still benefit from what they've learned. Supporting local food systems, builds community resilience while providing social and economic benefits. Buying from local farmers, supporting farmers markets, even growing food in home or community gardens. All of these strengthen local food security while building relationships and supporting local economies. Strong community connections, where neighbors know each other and cooperate regularly, create resilience against any kind of disruption, not just catastrophic ones. Preserving knowledge in forms that could survive catastrophe serves multiple purposes. Maintaining libraries of practical books, historical agricultural texts, craft guides, medical references, technical manuals, provides resources for current use while ensuring knowledge isn't lost if electronic systems fail. Teaching traditional skills to new generations, even as hobbies or supplementary education, keeps knowledge alive that might otherwise disappear. Museums that preserve historical tools, techniques, and knowledge serve educational purposes, while also maintaining a record of pre-industrial capabilities. At the policy level, strengthening critical infrastructure against disruption makes societies more resilient. Building redundancy into electrical grids, hardening vital systems against electromagnetic pulses, developing distributed rather than centralized systems, maintaining stocks of critical supplies like medicines and spare parts for infrastructure. All of these measures reduce vulnerability to catastrophic failures. They also provide resilience against more common disruptions like severe weather, accidents, or limited conflicts. Most fundamentally, we can appreciate what we have. The ability to flip a switch and have light, to turn a tap and have clean water, to access the collective knowledge of humanity through devices in our pockets, to communicate instantly with people across the globe, to travel hundreds of miles in a few hours, to treat diseases and injuries that would have been fatal to our ancestors. These are miracles that would have seemed like magic to people living just a few generations ago. They are miracles that could vanish in moments if we fail to maintain them and protect against the risks that could destroy them. The survivors of the scenario we've explored would be those who possessed practical skills, who built strong communities, who preserved knowledge, and who could adapt to radically changed circumstances. But you don't need to wait for catastrophe to begin developing these capabilities. They serve you well in ordinary times while preparing you for extraordinary ones. They make you more resilient, more capable, more connected to the fundamental realities of human existence. In the end, our exploration of this dark scenario teaches us several things. First, that civilization is more fragile than we often acknowledge, resting on complex systems whose failure could cascade catastrophically. Second, that humans are simultaneously vulnerable and resilient, vulnerable to disruptions of the systems we depend on, but resilient in our ability to adapt, survive, and eventually rebuild. Third, that the knowledge and skills that sustained our ancestors should not be forgotten, even as we enjoy modern conveniences, because that knowledge might someday be needed again, and because maintaining it enriches our lives, even in the present. Fourth, that community matters. Survival in the scenario we explored would depend heavily on communities working together, sharing knowledge and labor, supporting vulnerable members, and organizing collective efforts. The individualism celebrated in modern developed societies would be a liability in a world where survival depends on cooperation. Building strong communities now, creating networks of mutual support and shared knowledge, benefits us immediately while also creating resilience against potential future challenges. Fifth, that prevention is vastly preferable to survival. the best outcome is not to survive catastrophe with resilience and preparation, but to prevent catastrophe through wisdom, foresight, and collective action. Reducing nuclear risks, strengthening critical systems, building resilience into our civilization. These efforts might seem less dramatic than preparing for apocalypse, but they're far more likely to actually matter because they reduce the chance of catastrophe occurring in the first place. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the ordinary miracles that surround you. The light responding to your touch, the clean water flowing from taps, the comfortable bed that took no effort on your part to make, the secure walls keeping out weather and danger, the food that came to you through a network of remarkable complexity. All of this could be lost, but none of it must be lost. We have the knowledge to preserve what we've built, the wisdom to strengthen it, and the capability to ensure that the nightmares we've explored remain only nightmares. Sleep well, knowing that human ingenuity created the world of abundance and comfort in which you rest. Wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for that world and renewed commitment to preserving it, strengthening it, and ensuring that the catastrophes we've imagined never become reality. Through understanding both the fragility of our technological civilization and the resilience of the human spirit, we can work to build a future that is both prosperous and secure, abundant and sustainable, technologically advanced, and fundamentally resilient. The philosophical dimensions of survival. Beyond the practical challenges of survival lie profound philosophical and psychological questions that post-catastrophe communities would confront. What does it mean to be human when stripped of all the trappings of civilization? What values and meanings sustain people when existence is reduced to daily struggle? How do people maintain hope when there seems little reason for it? These aren't abstract intellectual exercises, but vital questions whose answers would shape whether communities thrived or failed, whether individuals found reasons to continue or surrendered to despair. The loss of future possibilities would weigh heavily on survivors who remembered the world before. Modern life is characterized by a sense of progress, of expanding possibilities, of a future that might be better than the present. Children are told they can become whatever they dream of becoming. Technologies continue advancing. Medicine continues improving. Knowledge continues expanding. This sense of forward motion, of potential, pervades modern consciousness, even when people don't explicitly think about it. The catastrophe would shatter this sense entirely. The future wouldn't be better than the present. It would be worse, at least for generations. Possibilities wouldn't expand. They would contract to the narrow range of what manual labor and pre-industrial technology allow. The knowledge that your children and grandchildren would live harder lives than you, that capabilities once taken for granted would never return in your lifetime, or perhaps ever. This reversal of expected progress would be psychologically devastating for many people, yet humans have lived without the expectation of progress for most of history. For thousands of years, people expected their lives to resemble their parents' lives, which resembled their grandparents' lives. Change occurred slowly enough to be nearly imperceptible within a single lifetime. People found meaning not in progress towards some better future, but in the cycles of seasons, in family and community, in religious or spiritual frameworks that gave cosmic significance to daily life, in the immediate satisfactions of work well done and relationships well maintained. Post-catastrophe survivors would need to rediscover or reinvent these sources of meaning. Religious and spiritual beliefs would likely play crucial roles in helping people process catastrophe and find meaning in survival. Throughout history, Religion has provided frameworks for understanding suffering, for finding purpose in hardship, for maintaining hope in desperate circumstances. Some survivors might turn to traditional religions, finding comfort in familiar beliefs and practices. Others might develop new religious or spiritual movements, interpreting the catastrophe through supernatural or cosmic lenses, perhaps seeing it as divine judgment, or as a test, or as a necessary cleansing before rebirth, or as part of some larger pattern beyond human understanding. These beliefs, whether they're true in any objective sense, could serve crucial psychological functions, helping people process trauma, maintain social cohesion, and find reasons to continue living and working toward the future. The question of whether to have children would confront survivors with terrible ethical dilemmas. In a world of hardship, disease, and high mortality, is it ethical to bring new life into existence knowing the suffering they'll face? Yet without children, humanity has no future. Communities need children to continue, to carry knowledge forward, to eventually rebuild. The decision to have children in post-catastrophe circumstances would be simultaneously an act of hope and an acceptance of causing suffering, a paradox that parents would need to navigate. The preservation of culture beyond mere survival skills would matter more than might be immediately apparent. Humans are not merely survival machines. We create art, music, stories, celebrations, rituals, things that have no immediate survival value, but that make life meaningful and worth living. Post-catastrophe communities that made space for these aspects of human experience, even while struggling for survival, would likely fare better psychologically than communities that focus solely on material survival. Songs sung while working make labor more bearable. Stories told in evenings provide entertainment and preserve knowledge while building community bonds. Holidays and celebrations mark the passage of time and give people things to look forward to. Art and beauty remind people of human capacity beyond mere survival. The question of how to treat those who can't fully contribute to community survival would test communities' values. The elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, young children, all require resources without being able to contribute proportionally, especially in the harsh calculus of survival at the margin. Throughout history, different societies have answered this question differently. Some have abandoned those who couldn't keep up. Others have maintained commitment to caring for all community members, even at cost to the group's material welfare. This isn't merely a practical decision, but a moral one that would define communities' character and potentially affect morale and cohesion. Communities that maintained commitment to vulnerable members, even at some cost, might find that this commitment strengthened social bonds and increased trust in ways that improved overall resilience. The relationship with the past would evolve as generations passed. The first generation would live with the constant weight of memory, comparing everything to what was lost. The second generation would know the past through parents' stories, viewing it with a mixture of longing and skepticism. The third generation would know it only as ancient history, increasingly mythologized and distant from their lived experience. How communities process this relationship with the past would matter. Some might venerate the past, treating salvaged artifacts from the previous civilization as sacred objects, telling and retelling stories of what was lost, perhaps letting nostalgia paralyze them. Others might reject the past, seeing the catastrophe as proof that the previous civilization was fatally flawed, choosing instead to embrace their new circumstances and build something different. A middle path, remembering the past with honesty, learning from both its achievements and its failures, taking what was valuable while moving forward, would likely serve communities best. The development of new cultural identities would be inevitable. Communities separated by distance and circumstance would develop differently, creating distinct cultures shaped by their environments, histories, and the particular mix of people and knowledge in each community. Over generations, these differences would compound. Languages might diverge as communities lost contact with each other and developed new vocabulary for their changed circumstances. Religious beliefs would evolve differently in different places. Social structures, values, and traditions would develop along separate paths. The cultural unity that characterized the pre-catastrophe world, where global communications allowed rapid spread of ideas and culture, would fracture into a diversity perhaps resembling the diversity of pre-industrial human societies, where every region developed distinctive culture over generations of relative isolation. The role of storytelling would be crucial for transmitting not just practical knowledge, but values, wisdom, and cultural identity. In pre-literate societies, and even in literate societies before mass media, stories served essential functions. They entertained, certainly, but they also taught. Stories about heroes and villains conveyed values and proper behavior. Stories about the natural world conveyed practical knowledge. Stories about the past preserved history. Post-catastrophe communities would likely develop rich oral traditions, with certain individuals recognized as particularly skilled storytellers, responsible for preserving and passing on crucial stories. These might include true histories of the catastrophe and its aftermath, fictionalized accounts teaching moral lessons, hero stories, celebrating community founders or leaders, cautionary tales warning against dangers, humorous stories providing levity, and spiritual stories explaining the cosmos and humanity's place in it. The gradual forgetting of the technological world would be both loss and liberation. Each generation would understand less about how the previous civilization worked. The third or fourth generation might look at a computer and have no conception of what it was or how it functioned, seeing it merely as a strange artifact from the ancient past. This loss of knowledge would be tragic in one sense. The accumulated understanding of centuries would be lost. But it might also be liberating, freeing people from the weight of comparison with what was lost, allowing them to fully inhabit their present without constantly measuring it against an idealized past they never knew. If you found this exploration of post-nuclear catastrophe valuable and thought-provoking, consider subscribing to DREAMLAB Knowledge. For more journeys into the profound questions that shape our understanding of humanity, civilization, and the future. Share this with others who might benefit from understanding both the fragility of our technological world and the resilience of the human spirit. Your support allows us to continue exploring these crucial topics that help us appreciate what we have while preparing thoughtfully for whatever challenges the future might bring. Together, we can build awareness, foster resilience, and work toward a future where such nightmares remain forever in the realm of imagination rather than reality.